I'm Ben Combee. I'm our dev platform architect for the Enyo JavaScript framework. So just to give you a little bit of background, Enyo is a framework that we've developed at HP. It originally came about because of a problem we had about a year and a half ago. We had this touchpad device coming out, and we needed a lot of applications for it, and the framework we developed that run on the WebOS phones wasn't going to scale up very well for tablet-type devices. So came around, and our framework team started working on Enyo, which is our component-based framework for building applications that scale everywhere from mobile phones to tablets to desktop computers. One of the ideas behind Enyo was that we wanted a way for people to build applications for the web and for devices when they weren't necessarily HTML and CSS experts. And looking at kind of the methods that had worked well for getting lots of people to build applications in the past, we settled on a model based around components. How many in the room were developers in the 90s? Okay, a few of you. If you remember, there was a system Microsoft came out with called Visual Basic, and VB was looked down by many in the programming world, but it was a really fast way to build an application. You drew out an application, you placed all these components, you had them talking to each other, sending messages. The component model may not be super sexy, it may not be the latest MVC fad, but it really works for building applications. So one of the core bases of Enyo is components. Now, the touchpad came, it went. Now we're kind of in the, now we're in a new model. So the second part of what you want to take away from Enyo, well, cross-platform, originally it was built for our tablets. Then we figured out how to make it work on our phones. And then when we rebooted the whole Enyo process back in January, we were like, okay, we can't be linked to one operating system. We really want to build a way for people to bring applications to a whole variety of devices. So cross-platform is also one of the key strengths that we've been building around. Final area which I want to talk about, open source. We looked at, lots of people have built great Enyo One apps for the touchpad, but they were locked onto that device. And we looked at a lot of the JavaScript frameworks that are out there. Some of them work really well, but were open source. Some of them work really well, but were closed. We wanted something that people could pick up, could use to build whatever kind of application. We ended up picking the Apache 2.0 license for Enyo because it had the right combination of things like patent protection, open access to the source, but it allowed our users to not just build an application on top of it and ship that, but they actually could build their own frameworks, their own tools, their own platforms on top of Enyo and go with that as well. So we're Apache 2, we're going to stick with that forever, and it's a good thing. And all of our stuff is up on GitHub. So let's actually, the title of this talk was a deep dive on Enyo. And I've been the developer platform architect for quite a while. I'm now the lead developer on the project. And let's jump and actually look at what makes Enyo unique, what makes it special, kind of coming from the inside, the core stuff going out. So if I switched over to my handy text editor here, and you actually look at the Enyo project, we have a bunch of folders here under the source directory, and each of them is kind of a core piece of it. So I'll be going through a few slides here talking about what's in each of those folders and what it actually means for a framework developer or a developer using the framework. So first we have boot. The object of boot is to actually get your application up and running. And the key idea here is that an Enyo application is structured as basically an index.html file that loads all this JavaScript. And then the JavaScript runs and actually builds your application into the web page. And as part of that, we have this dependency system. Every folder has a package.js file. And the package.js file just lists other JavaScript files, other CSS files that get loaded for the application. So an example here, it's JavaScript code. It's going to run and say, hey, I need app.js. I need to load the CSS file for it. And I also need to load one of the libraries. A key idea behind Enyo is that we have a core library that's at 17K that Enda talked about this morning. We also have a series of libraries that build on that core to provide additional functionality. And To load up a library, you just list it in your depends. In this case, I'm listing the Onyx library, which I'll talk about later. And not only is this great for when you're debugging and you're kind of loading all this code at runtime, but we also have minify scripts that will take all these various package.js files you have and use these to figure out, okay, here's your entire application. Let's stick it into a single .js file that you can load in PhoneGap or load on a web page. So that's boot. The next section is kernel, OOP, object-oriented programming. So this is a key concept in Enyo. The idea is that we have this function, enyo.kind. It's a constructor factory. What that means, so those of you familiar with JavaScript, hopefully everyone here, JavaScript is a prototypical language. You can have constructor functions that create new objects for you, and basically the function, you call it with new whatever gets sent an empty object, then you fill it in the constructor. Enyo.kind is a way to build those constructors and build them in a really structured way. Let's look at an example here. So in this code here, I'm actually defining a new kind, which I call Firefly. We might have used the word class, except class is already a reserved word in JavaScript, so kind is what we're stuck with. So I'm creating Firefly. That next line is saying I'm basing it on a previous kind. So we have the idea of inheritance, that you can take a kind and have this whole inheritance tree of kinds going all the way back to our core kind object. And then I'm defining a function which is going to be a member of the Firefly kind. In this case, I'm just going to, this inherit is really important. It's the way that you basically run your super kind, your parent kind. So I'm saying, okay, run anything that my television show.show does, and then call system play to play an MP4 file. So once you've done this kind function, that's actually going to create a new function called Firefly. We run it to create Firefly, we wait 10 weeks, and we cancel it. Delete it. So that's the basic level. Kinds are constructors. Now, we have a whole object hierarchy on top of kinds. Enyo Object provides property publishing. What does this mean? Okay, here I'm creating an object called UPC. I'm basing it on Enyo Object, and it has a published property called product ID. So product ID, we have a default value for it, and because it's a published property, we're automatically going to create a set product ID and a get product ID function, as well as product ID changed as a hook for you to basically monitor whenever that value changes and do some action on it. So in this case, when you call create is automatically called when you ever create an object. It's going to call product ID change to have it process that product ID, and hey, then you generated a barcode to go along with it, stuck it in this barcode. How do you use it? Well, here I'm creating a new UPC, I'm giving a default product ID, and here's a call to set that, to change it later on, or I'm getting it using the getProductID method. So that's all Object provides. Object provides a way for doing these published properties. This becomes really useful later on because published properties are how we let you design entire applications and specialize them for your particular use. The next level is Enyo Component. Enyo Component is based on Object, but this provides our encapsulation model as well as our event model. So one of the really important ideas is that objects can own other objects. So, well, here's an example. I'm creating a Sith Lord kind here. I'm basing it on the Jedi kind I already happen to have. And I'm creating an on-speak event. So someone that owns an instance of this Sith Lord object can actually listen for it to speak and then do something based on that. And so if I call scream on it, it's going to speak whatever message and probably do it in a whiny voice. So coming along here, I'm going to create a Sith Lord's object, and it owns several different Sith Lord instances. And that components array is actually set up to, you can specify here's all the various sub-objects that are owned by it. This is has a relationship rather than is a relationship. So if you're building up an application of all these pieces, you might have several buttons, and they're all going to be in the components array. The other thing is I set up so that because the Sith Lord does a do speak to send a speak event, I've set up an event handler here where it's going to call my listen to toys function whenever that particular instance of it speaks. And then here's using it. Create some Sith Lords, tell Darth Vader to use a lightsaber, tell him to throw the Palpatine around, and then finally go, no! Another key concept here is this $ hash. Every object that owns other components has a $ hash table. And basically all the elements of it are based on the names of its owned objects. So kind of going back to here, I refer to the Darth Vader that I own by toys.$Darth Vader. And it's a very useful way to be able to interact with everything in your code. So that's the basic object model that we have. Everything in Enyo is built on this object model. And it allows for a really nice encapsulation model for being able to build up whole hierarchies of components and specify some really complex user interfaces. We have an Enyo UI component base kind. This we actually use as kind of an abstraction. I'll talk about how we deal with the DOM next and Enyo controls based on this. But we also have a canvas library which derives from UI component for doing things involving games, involving graphical objects. We have an Enyo signals object. This is for how you deal with application level events. Something like your window being resized at the HTML level is causing a DOM event that gets sent to the document or sent to the window. Signals is a way to own things in various levels in your hierarchy that deal with that. And then the core code has lots of other things, a lot of utilities, functions, logging functions, templating, phone gap support. Nothing here is super core to the Enyo platform. It's just provided for you. So that's that directory. Now we come to DOM. This is how we deal with HTML. The key thing here is enyo.control. A control is a component that actually results in some sort of HTML being rendered onto the page. So here's an example of this. I'm creating a control which is going to render out a div tag, and I'm calling it bumper sticker. The content of it, which is what's going to go inside the div tag, is I'm fluent in JavaScript, which, unfortunately we didn't print out those bumper stickers, but I really wish we had. And then I've also set a style tag on it. And so whenever this is rendered in the page, it's going to have that style. But if you're doing something at runtime and you want to change the way it looks, like do a red version of it, then you can just go and modify the style property, and it will automatically change the already rendered version into the page. So I create a new bumper sticker instance, and I have this render into call. That's going to tell it to generate all the HTML for it, and then stick it into whatever particular element, in this case a document body. So if I ran this code, I just have that bumper sticker div stuck into my page. We have dispatcher, which is how we hook all of the standard DOM events. Enyo has its own kind of parallel event system to what you normally have. So, tapping on something would generate an on-click event normally, and it would, first bubble down, then bubble back up. We intercept that in order to be able to deal with the cross-platform differences. One of the ways we do that is by providing a default tap event. So in this case, I've set up a tap function, and so if someone actually clicked on that bumper sticker, then I'm going to handle it by bringing up an alert. But we have kind of a much more sophisticated thing. Like I showed earlier, you can create your own custom events, and those can be sent up and down the hierarchy of objects as well. The next big section is AJAX. Every JavaScript framework has to have an AJAX system, so we have it too. We designed this so that you can create just a new Enyo AJAX object. You can set up various response and error handlers. And even though in this code I only call response once, the idea is that you can call it multiple times if you want to have more than one handler for that success in place. So we have an Enyo AJAX object. We also have an Enyo JSON P request object if you want to use JSON P. And depending on the platform, like for WebOS with Enyo, we have a whole separate async type object for dealing with system service calls. So we set up a response, we set up an error, then we tell it to go, and now it's going to go do the AJAX in the background and eventually call one of those handlers. We have the UI section. So when we were developing our Onyx widget set, which I'll show you some fun stuff later on, we found that there was a lot of stuff where we just needed adapters to hook up standard HTML form elements into our event system. So these files provide kind of hooks to hooking up input, checkboxes, rich text, all these kind of items, and get them into the Enyo event model. One big area, this is something we've been working, sorry about that, the scroller model. Scrollers are how we handle showing a lot of content in a limited amount of space. By default with an application, we try to render it into a fixed area, either the window size, the document size that you have. And then we use a scroller to actually scroll individual areas of the page. So you might have an application that renders controls on the top of the screen and the bottom of the screen, but then your content in the middle is actually what your user wants to move around. So the scroller handles all the details of dealing with touch events, dealing with mouse events, showing thumbs, just scrolling smoothly over the region. We also take advantage of things like 3D CSS transforms in order to make that scrolling experience even smoother. Okay, so that's the core Enyo code. That's what you get with your 17K. But then we have some additional libraries on top of it that we've built to add more functionality to actually make this a full platform for building applications. So the first of these is what we call layout, and layout has a few different areas. First, we have Fittable. This is how you do responsive app layouts. Here's kind of an example. This is actually from our layout sample in our SDK. The idea with layout is you can set up a particular column or you can set up a row where the components that are in that column or row, most of them take on the natural size. So if you have a div with text in it, it's going to be as wide as that text. However, you want some area to be able to grow to fill up the rest of the space. Like a common case is where you have a toolbar at the top, you have content in the middle, something at the bottom. You want that div to grow to fill up the space in the area. So Fittable does all the hard work of laying things out, measuring things in the DOM, adjusting the sizes so that it works, and also dealing with when the window gets resized, making sure everything gets laid out well again. We have List. This is optimized scrolling through potentially thousands of items. So one of the big problems on mobile devices has been performance. And if you look at how a lot of mobile operating systems implement lists, they implement it through a page model where they're only keeping track of a few items at a time. The list code here is, in fact, basically it's calling an event over and over again to render each of these rows. But it does it only a few, maybe 50 items at a time, enough so you can have what you see on the screen and a little bit above the screen, a little bit below the screen. And we basically do a magic trick of when the user scrolls, we move all that really quickly, and then we end up filling in the rest of the content as soon as that's over. So each time you scroll, you get a quick scroll, and it's able to do all that processing in the background or when the user is not actually moving their finger on the screen. List is a great way to kind of show lots of data. This is our contacts example from it. We have Panels, which is our configurable app layout system. So panels work on the idea of arrangers. So effectively here on this screen, what we have are 3, 4, 5 different cards or different views of information. And depending on what arranger you pick, it can show them overlapping, it can show them one at a time, it can show them in a type of carousel view. If you're doing an application where you're like having lots of different data that you can select, this is a great way to deal with that. And the arranger system also lets you do nice things like set up drag controls, which I'll show when we get to some demos of being able to switch between different views at runtime. Then we have Tree, which is a work in progress control, and this is how you can show structured information. And the nice thing to remember about the Enyo component model is, so this tree can just be one piece in the middle of a whole view in the application. So you could have a set of panels, you could have a tree in one of them, clicking on the tree value, you can then adjust something in another panel. And all this works because you click on the tree, it sends an event up to its owner, and that owner can then send events back down or call methods of the items it owns. So now let's introduce Onyx. This has all been foundation work. This has all been like, what do we need to do to get performance? How do we interact with all these devices? Onyx is where things get pretty. So an example I like to use, if Enyo is jQuery, very useful by itself, then Onyx is a jQuery UI. This is a library that extends our core to do some really nice things. Onyx is composed of some CSS theme work, a lot of JavaScript behavior work, and then composite controls, where we do more than just use a single div, but actually combine a lot of different HTML rendered items together. Just to give you an example of what the UI looks like, if you've used WebOS in the past, you'll notice it's somewhat familiar, but we've done a lot of work with our HI team to come up with a really nice look and feel that doesn't necessarily feel native on any device, but feels familiar, that people can find instantly usable. And we've also done a huge amount of work on actually filling out this Onyx widget set. Among the other things we have are buttons, checkboxes, drawers. You can read. There's a lot of items there that you can play with in your application. So let's look at some samples. First we're going to look at is Onyx Sampler. This is an actual live view of all the Onyx controls. We use this in testing and development to see how things interact, to try out new attributes. So just tabbing over to my friendly web browser. This kind of gives you an idea of all the different things. We have group buttons, which automatically change depending on what you're doing. Let's see. Icon buttons that use images as a background. We have toolbars, toggle buttons to turn on and off. All these kind of fun things that you can use for building up your application user interface. The next sample is Flickr Search. So the Flickr Search here is going to be using, this is actually using our panels in our Onyx widget set. So I've done a search here on Japan, and if I click one of these, I'm basically tapping on a list item there, sends an event which causes this panel to update. But if I go over here and drag over on this, then I resize this to fill up the whole screen. And I can drag it back to its original smaller size. We have a Bing Maps. This is actually using a library that we originally developed for the touchpad for the application there. And this is using Microsoft's Bing control. They provide this as JavaScript code you can download from their site. We've turned it into an Enyo control and embedded it here in an application. This is also using a slide-out tab panel. So if I drag this over, then I have all the controls for letting me do things like toggle on traffic, and that all redraws in the background. API Viewer. So this is actually bundled with the SDK, and this is a live, it reads Enyo source code as well as a library source live, and then gives you an online documentation viewer so you can see the way to use all these various kinds in your application. So here I've gone through, and it's, okay, we're looking at Enyo component, but if we want to look at the checkbox, then it adds there. And this source code, this one actually we don't have source code available yet. It's just more of an example of an Enyo app. We provide this in minimized form. Crypto Tweets is a game that I built using Enyo and Onyx and the web services. And let's see here. So in Crypto Tweets, we're actually going through, let me increase the size here. And this is doing a few interesting things. I mean, first off, we have a bunch of Onyx buttons up here that if we tap on, we'll do modifications. I have all of these cells are individual Enyo controls. And so when they get a mouse over event, it sends an event up in the system saying, hey, the mouse moved over me, and this is what value I have. Then the owner of it sends an event back down saying, okay, any of the cells that happen to match this, change your style and redraw yourself. So as we move the mouse around to pick a letter that we want to guess, the ones that match that all highlight. Then it uses the Onyx pop-up, so if I tap on it, then it's saying, okay, what do you want to guess that to be? If I change that, then they all change that way. And this is using our web service interface through the Enyo Ajax call to go and, in this case, fetch new tweets from the top tweet Twitter feed and use that to build cryptograms. So if I keep hitting hint, we'll eventually find out what the latest favorite celebrity is saying online today. Great night tonight, great. Yeah, I'm not saying this is necessarily good content. It's just out there. And then another thing I'm really excited to show is our community gallery. One of the things that when we started on the Enyo 2.0 project is we really wanted to involve our developers to help build this. So, we're working on figuring out ways for people to contribute to the core code, but we've had a huge amount of interest in people kind of building their own widgets and adding them to our library. So what we created was this, the community gallery. This is actually on enyojs.com, and each of these buttons here is actually, well, this is an Enyo application that's running off a JSON database that loads at runtime. You click on this, and now you're seeing a control that someone in our community has built up and provided for other developers to use. So if you don't see what you need in our basic Onyx widget set, you can often, we have over 30 items here where people have just come up with new wrappers, new ways to interact with the system. And we're really excited about increasing this even more as people, more and more people use the framework. And the source code for this is in GitHub if you want to play around with it. So that brings me to the whole idea of the Enyo community. We started out with kind of a very closed development process working on WebOS. We were building our own framework. We had our own application team. We were building all these apps that were shipping on a device, which came out last summer. And so we were very close, very insular. Well, going open means that we need to have a lot of interaction with the community. We need to involve lots of people. So we've developed ways for interaction to happen. One of the big ones is our developer forums. Since we opened these back in January, we've had hundreds and hundreds of threads, people asking questions about Enyo, sharing the projects they've done, and it's just been an amazing resource. And both me and our developer relations team, the other engineering members of this, frequently go answer the questions people have and use that feedback to incorporate back into the framework. We have a blog where we're not only highlighting developer tips, but we're also paying a lot of attention to the applications our developers release. So if someone does a great application, we're going to try to publicize it and make sure other people know about it. Our Twitter account's very popular, and some of the people here in the room with us are some of the managers of that. So if you want to chat with them, we have a booth back in the convention area. And then our email address, enyojs@palm.com, is available if you have any questions, not necessarily for technical help, but more like meta questions about the framework. We also have an open development process. All of the code that we're working on is currently checked into GitHub. We've tagged all the major releases. The last big release we did was Beta 4 at the end of April. We're getting close to a Beta 5 release, and after that, probably the next releases are kind of 2.0 final, where we consider our initial base widget set to be complete. But we're very open for people forking, modifying this. Please send us a nice pull request if you find bugs or little things need changing. Working on a process for larger changes so that things kind of beyond the realm of just a single couple of lines of code. And we're constantly soliciting ideas on our developer forums and asking people to submit to the community gallery. And then finally, just in case any of you are looking for a change in your career, we are definitely in the middle of hiring some great JavaScript engineers. If you know things about cross-platform apps, if you're interested in web performance, you've worked on your own frameworks, talk to us. We have positions available here in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, and who knows where else. So that's Enyo. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. I'll be able to take a couple of questions here before we wrap up. Anything for the audience? Okay, well, oh, yes. Very good question. We currently support WebKit-based browsers, so that's Chrome and Safari. We support Firefox. Basically, any recent version of Firefox should work. I think maybe after like about Firefox 8, but we're mainly testing the most recent one there. Internet Explorer, our baseline version is version 8, which is the last one that shipped for XP. We looked at supporting earlier ones, but there's just way too much hassle for IE 6 and 7. The core, it depends also on which part you're looking at. Like the core Enyo library probably can work back that far, but the Onyx widget set we've only been testing on IE 8 and later. We test on Opera occasionally, and we're doing extensive checking on iOS and Android browsers and also PhoneGap on those systems. And Touchpad browser is a bit of a tough case. We generally work there, but we actually, a lot of the WebOS support code we had in Enyo 1, we're in the middle of getting moved over to a new library, or actually we have one of our big WebOS community guys, Jay Robitaille, is working as an intern this summer to kind of help build out a WebOS support library. Yeah, and he's right here in the audience if you want to shake his hand. We're working closely with the Open WebOS team, and they fully intend on using Enyo 2, and we're working with them, but we don't have anything to announce on their behalf right now. Any other questions? Okay, well, if you want to talk one-on-one with us, we have a big booth there in the convention area. We're handing out T-shirts and showing off demos of the apps. can show source code, and thank you all for attending.